Jalon Walker is back in the action, but will he play in the preseason? And how much does the preseason actually matter?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong as the humble host of this illustrious podcast, been going strong, coming up on 9 years this Thanksgiving. And I appreciate each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today we are going to be going into my research that suggests why I think preseason matters. We'll also talk about why it's harder for me to get hyped about, all the things that are going on currently in training camp and practice. But we'll start off, talking about Jalon Walker, right? The Falcons had another padded practice on Tuesday. And they featured some one-on-ones in those padded practice. Jalon Walker participated in that. There's a clip of him beating Jack Nelson, our beloved Jack Nelson. Shout out to our friend of the podcast, Maria Martin of 11 Alive, for putting that clip out there on Twitter. And you saw him have a winning rep against Jack Nelson. I know we've seen a couple of these reps against Jack Nelson so far since Jalon Walker's arrival. And Jack is like, hey, can we show some of his other reps? But on that rep, he showed some power, showed a initial knockback power on some bull rush. I saw some discourse online in the Locked On Falcons Discord, as well as on Twitter, about, Jalon's inability to potentially finish that rep. And he got that sort of initial knockback, but, Nelson was eventually able to anchor, and then Walker couldn't quite get past him. And I think it's a useful conversation to talk about sort of how much we can glean from practice as part of this ongoing conversation that we're going to have today about how much practice versus preseason versus obviously the regular season matters. And despite Walker not quite finishing, on those bull rushes like he showed on that particular play, your ability to finish those plays is due to a leg drive. It's no different than hitting a blocking sled. And that was something that I don't think Walker did a good job of at Georgia, where he would try to use a bull rush and he wouldn't use that leg drive to finish those reps. So he would get that initial knockback power, but then offensive tackles were able to anchor. And him not finishing on this particular rep, again, we're judging one rep, is not a big deal to me because it's practice, right? Because if he finishes a rep in practice, like he's supposed to in a game, he's driving that offensive tackle into the lap of the quarterback, which is a no-no, and that puts the quarterback at injury risk and all that stuff. And then even on these one-on-ones, when there's no quarterback on the play, like in this rep, the equipment manager who's standing in for the quarterback, or whoever that coaching intern or whatever it is, you're putting that guy at risk, right? There was a rep last year from Falcons legend Albert Huggins when he was with the Cowboys in a joint practice against the Rams, where he beat a guy and pushed the equipment guy, and it started a fight and he got thrown out of practice, right? The equipment guy is not out there volunteering like Raheem Morris to get wrecked by Drake London in some of these one-on-ones like Raheem did on Monday. Right, this 150-pound equipment manager is like, hey, I ain't about that life, Raheem. You if you want to do that, then by all means. So I don't think it's that big a deal that Jalon Walker didn't finish the rep because it's practice, right? That's why it's more important to pay attention to what happens in the games, because that's where he can finish these types of reps. And so ultimately, we're going to figure out in the games whether or not Jalon Walker has developed a bull rush. This rep doesn't really tell us that. He didn't really have that in 2024 when he was at Georgia. Will he have that in 2025? Now that he's in Atlanta, that's time will tell on that. But it's probably going to be a while before we get to see Jalon Walker in the game, right? It doesn't seem like he's on track to play this Friday against Detroit in the preseason opener, right? Being limited on both Monday and Tuesday practices. The Wednesday's practice will be a scrimmage. there's hope that maybe he'll be a full participant then, and that will allow Raheem to give him a chance to play on Friday. But I'm skeptical of that at this stage. And then we will then talk about him potentially playing in the Titans game the following week. And then the concern you have, at least if you're me, and maybe others are less concerned about it, we'll talk about that later. But, the concern is that they'll have the joint practices, and Raheem will I saw enough from Jalon Walker in the joint practices that we don't need to play him in that Tennessee, in that second preseason game. And then we know for the third preseason in the finale against Dallas, he's almost certainly not going to play. As we talked about on yesterday's episode, only 51 players last summer played in that preseason finale against Jacksonville. It led to a blowout loss. I think it was 31-0 or whatever. Very clear the Falcons were we only believe in playing 2 preseason games. That third preseason game, we ain't about that. We're just wrapping it up. We're just going through the motions. Hopefully we'll see a little bit something different just to keep us slightly entertained. Emory Jones, Easton Stick, please do your best. But, that game last year only had about a dozen guys that wound up playing, ultimately making the 53-man roster that played in that preseason finale is the point I'm trying to make. And I wouldn't bet that Jalon Walker is going to be one of those dozen guys this year. So it does sort of stress the importance of games over practice. And I had a couple of Locked On Falcons insiders ask me, since training camp has begun, sort of has the positives coming out of Falcons practice moved the needle for me over these last 14 days since training camp began? And my answer to that question is no. Right? Because I put a lot more stock in the games for the aforementioned reasons. And the questions I have about the Falcons heading into this season aren't going to be really answered this summer. Some of them will, and we'll break down those questions as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. This episode is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. Since the NFL season is nearly upon us, that means fantasy football is back in full swing. And this year, Yahoo Fantasy is turning things up with a fantasy football experience like never before. This year, I'm playing Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too, whether you're a first-timer or a veteran making your millionth league. I've been a Yahoo Fantasy user for years, and the updates they're rolling out this month are, pun intended, fantastic. To celebrate 28 years of fantasy football greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days throughout August. To kick it off, they just dropped the Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine Leagues, a killer new way to play fantasy football on Yahoo, where the lowest scoring team gets eliminated each week until there's one team left standing. With the season around the corner, now's the time to get your league together and give this new mode a try. If you're more into the classics, you can still play in a head-to-head private league or join a public league. Stay tuned for more killer announcements and start playing Yahoo Fantasy now at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. So as I said, I've had Locked On Falcons insiders. Most recently this morning, one named Cody asked me, are your hopes rising for this team as the preseason moves along? And my answer to Cody's question was no. But, Cody can ask these questions because he is a Locked On Falcons insider. Great opportunity for you guys. If you want to ask direct, specific questions to me about whatever, you can do so as a Locked On Falcons insider. Join at the link in the description below. And not only can you get that access to me, you also get access to the film breakdowns I do. Did a 2-hour Jeff Ulbrich defense breakdown a couple of weeks ago. Most recently looked at, the free agents that I didn't get around to in the spring, including Tegan Cotoriano, Felipe Franks, Jamal Agnew, as well as DJ Chark for good measure. So you can join and check that out for free right now. 14-day free trial when you become a Locked On Falcons insider today, then $4.99 a month after that point at the link in the description below. But again, my answer to Cody's question about, are my hopes rising was no, because my hopes are tied to questions that really won't be answered until September, right? We started at the beginning of training camp, 3 storylines, main storylines this summer about the quarterback, about whether the young players are going to play and our guys going to play in the preseason. We're talking about whether guys are going to be playing in the preseason right now, and that will continue to be a topic of conversation the rest of this week, as well as probably next week. We'll get to see the young guys play on Friday, but so far the buzz has been promising, and hopefully that gets delivered in the preseason games. And we've talked before about the quarterback, mostly being up. Another good day of practice for Michael Penix by all accounts on Tuesday, but mostly being up and having some ups and downs. He did throw an interception on Tuesday, right? But according to Zach Robinson, that's not really an interception because actually there was a wasp, flying around DeMarco Hellams' face, and Michael Penix threw the football and was trying to kill the wasp because he knew the wasp was going to sting DeMarco Hellams, that he would, get taken out of practice to get that treated. And he knows, Michael Penix that is, that DeMarco Hellams needs all the reps that he can get. And so he was actually being a great leader by killing that wasp and throwing that interception to DeMarco Hellams. It just so happened that DeMarco Hellams caught the ball that killed the wasp that was going to kill DeMarco Hellams. So he actually saved his life. You just don't know what you're seeing when you see Michael Penix throw an interception. That's what Zach Robinson. I got that text right after that interception. So he texted me directly to make sure that I came in here on this podcast and cleared the air, that Michael Penix does not make mistakes. He does not miss throws. He does not throw interceptions. He's actually being a great leader at that point. So all jokes aside, my questions for this team heading into the season, how good is Michael Penix going to be? Will Kyle Pitts actually be used? How good is this run game going to be? None of those are going to get really answered until September. Like when we talk about Penix, again, we get glimpses of how good Michael Penix is going to be in practice, but we know practice is not the same as the game, right? There's no real pass rush in practice, right? Now, kudos to Raheem Morris for basically saying we value 11 on 11s versus 7 on 7s, because that means that the offensive linemen are out on the field and we're simulating what a real pass rush is being, as opposed to 7 on 7 when there's absolutely no pass rush. It's just, breathing easy. You can take your sweet time. It's a relaxing bath. You know what I'm saying? But so the Falcons are doing their best to try to maximize these practice reps to get as close to the game. But it's, 11 on 11 is better than 7 on 7, but it's far from what a game is going to be. And then on top of that, when you actually get to the actual preseason games, let alone the regular season games, they ain't game planning against you in a preseason game. So even then, you're getting a very vanilla version of that. Now, when you look at Kyle Pitts, my question about that, right? We've seen Kyle Pitts look good in the summer. Will it translate in the fall? We'll see. Is Zach Robinson actually going to use him? We'll see, right? When we talk about the run game, we've talked all offseason about, is there going to be drop off like there was last year when Drew Dahlman was in the lineup versus when Ryan Uza was in the lineup, right? The stats from last year indicate that it was a significant drop off between those guys in terms of the run game, whether we're talking about the short yardage, whether we're talking about their efficiency against playoff caliber defenses. And I'll link in the description below, the episode where we broke all that stuff down. The other factor with the run game, how big a leap is Matthew Bergeron going to make, right? We saw Bijan Robinson on the Pivot podcast over the weekend. He was out here pumping Bergeron, right? Whatever B word that means the same thing with Bergeron, right? But we saw Raheem pumping the defense last year on the Pivot podcast. And basically, as I'll say, words mean absolutely nothing when Falcon people go on Pivot podcast. I will believe it when I see it. And then, we talk about Zach Robinson diversifying the run game. Our good buddy Will McFadden over at AtlantaFalcons.com on Friday asked Zach Robinson directly, hey, are you diversifying the run game? And Zach Robinson was like, we're going to stick with our, staple of wide zone, but we got some changeups coming, right? And the question I have is, how many changeups, right? Is it a 5% shift in run game? That's basically one new run per game, right? Now, 20% would be, 5 new runs, which is to me significant, which would put the Falcons more in line with what the rest of the NFL is doing when it comes to outside zone versus other things, right? But even Zach Robinson said, you're not going to see that until the regular season. So again, as I say, actions speak louder than words. You can talk the talk, but you ultimately got to walk the walk. And this time of year during the summer, it's all talk, right? And so all of these questions about the offense are not going to get answered until September. And we know that how far this team is going to go is based off of how far their offense is going to take them. If they're a top 10 offense, hey, they got a real good shot at making the playoffs. If they're not a top 10 offense, well, there's always next year, as they say, right? Well, maybe not for all the people in the building. There's always next year, but for somebody, there will always be next year. And so when we look at the defensive questions, I do think some of those questions will be answered, particularly how good are the young defenders? Now, the other questions I have are, will these guys with the pass rush win their one-on-ones? We'll get to see a glimpse of that in the preseason games. Will they be able to stop the run? Again, we'll get to see a glimpse of that in the regular season. Will the secondary be as good in coverage? Again, glimpses of that in the preseason game. Will the linebackers, blossom in the scheme? Probably won't get to see that because I don't think Caden Ellis and Devon Diablo are going to play in the preseason. So some of those questions will get answered, particularly when it comes to the young guys and what they're going to add to it. But in terms of the veterans, we don't really know what those guys are going to be as the scheme shifts and whatnot. And so, how much these young players get to play in the preseason is kind of the big question that remains to be seen. But that gets us to discussing what the preseason is really about. I think one of the biggest myths out there that I often find when I engage with fans about the preseason and or training camp is that it's a prelude or a preview to the regular season. And in reality, the preseason and training camp are about figuring out who are the guys that are going to make the roster. That's really what it's primarily here for, right? And we know in the Falcons case, there's roughly 40 or so guys that we can say are locks or near locks to make the roster barring injury. And this time, these next 3 weeks particularly are really about figuring out who those last final dozen guys are at the various back end roster positions, the handful of starting spots like, starting nickel, starting safety, starting kicker, etc. Over these next couple of weeks. And so, the things that people think when it's a preview, and you imagine clearly hypothetically, because it ain't happening. But if Raheem changes his mind and he decides, hey, I'm going to play the starters. Y'all have been complaining for years. I'll make you happy. We're going to play the starters for one series against the Titans next week. And the starters go down the field. The starting offense, that is, goes down the field in 8 plays and scores a touchdown. Everybody's going to be sitting there going, oh my God, this offense isn't going to be incredible. Did you see what they did on that one series? Again, that's the perception that it's a preview of what's going to happen in the regular season. You saw it happen one time in the preseason. It's going to happen 100 times in the regular season. And that's wrong. Simply put, it's wrong. Preseason games aren't real games. Teams don't game plan. It's vanilla stuff, right? It's why back in 2023, when the Falcons played their starters for one series against the Bengals, and everybody was sitting here going, oh my God, this was the greatest drive ever assembled by Desmond Ridder. This offense is really going to hum. And I was sitting there on that Saturday and I'm like, whatever. And everybody was mad at me. And I sit here and I look back and I'm like, once again, Aaron Freeman was right and you were wrong. And if only you had the ego to refer to yourself in the third person, maybe you could get on my level. But preseason, the point of all that is to say preseason is not good at judging units because of how vanilla and basic it is, right? Preseason is about judging individuals because of how vanilla and basic it is, right? Because it's the basics. Can you execute this block? Can you execute this pass rush? Can you run this route? Can you make this tackle, right? Because if you can't execute the basics at a high level in the preseason, you certainly are not going to be able to execute the complex things that we're going to throw at you in the regular season at a high level. And so therefore you should not be on this team's roster, or if you are on the team's roster, you shouldn't be playing that much. You see that with Rukaroro last summer. We focused on the one great rep he had against Baltimore where he got that sack. Ooh, it was so clean. It was so incredible. But we ignore the 24 other reps where he was getting mauled in the run game. And then y'all sit here shocked that he's inactive for the first month of the season because he wasn't ready. Because it's like, we're not taking Grady Jarrett off the field because of one stinking preseason rep against a backup guard against the Baltimore Ravens. We need you to be able to contribute as a run defender, Rook, and you're not ready to do that. And so therefore it took him a month to see the field. And people are like, I don't understand why he's not inactive, because you're not paying attention. Okay. And no one seems to understand this, but I say all that to say, if you want to be hyped, then be hyped, guys. It's August. There ain't nothing better to do. Okay. But y'all were hyped last year. And then we got the Bruno game in week 1. And that gets us to how we're going to finish today's episode, talking about, does playing your starters in the preseason impact early season performance? I believe the answer is yes, and I have some data that backs it up. So we love summer sports, don't we? And just because the NBA season is over and while the NFL preseason is upon us, the actual games that matter are yet to begin. But guess what, guys? That doesn't mean that FanDuel isn't still the best way to get in on all the action, whether it's baseball, soccer, golf, tennis, WNBA, or NBA Summer League, that is still going strong. And you're already following the action, so why not make it a little bit more thrilling with FanDuel? FanDuel is going to give you so many opportunities to win. Not only you can bet on when Matt Olson hits his next homer, if the Atlanta Dream are going to hit their over-under win totals for the season, or if Bijan Robinson is going to lead the league in rushing, running behind Matthew Bergeron and Ryan Newsel. FanDuel is easy to use. It's fast to pay out. So what are you waiting for? And if you're new to FanDuel, make sure you sign up at FanDuel.com, because new customers can bet just $5 and they'll get $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. All you got to do is open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Again, check it out. Win your first $5 bet, you'll get $150 in bonus bets at FanDuel.com today. So let's before we get into it, let's revisit that whole notion of the Bruno game, referring to that week 1 debacle last year against Pittsburgh. We don't talk about it. That's why we call it the Bruno game. But I've seen consistently over the last 11 months, people that consistently seemed to try to connect the struggles of the offense in that game being to the Falcons not playing their guys in the preseason. And even as someone who is an advocate for playing your guys in the preseason, I feel like that's a massive reach. And the reason is because, yes, the Falcons did look rusty, but I feel like you're focusing on the rust and ignoring the terrible coaching in that game, right? The lack of play action, deciding putting Caleb McGarry on an island against TJ Watt. Again, it sounds like an exaggeration, but that's got to be the worst game plan I've ever seen in the history of my life as a Falcon fan. And you're probably sitting there going, is that why you hate Zach Robinson? And it's like, I don't hate Zach Robinson, right? We're texting about Michael Penix every day. So clearly we don't hate each other. But he did dig himself a massive hole on that particular Sunday. I think he climbed his way out of that hole. But it is a massive black eye, a massive red flag. And, essentially you were supposed to be this offensive genius and you came up with the worst game plan I've ever seen. It's going to, it's why I remain skeptical of Mr. Robinson, despite our friendly banter back and forth on the phone. So, like I said, I am an advocate of playing guys in the preseason. Your starters, particularly. We know Raheem Morris is not an advocate of that. We know where he stands on it. I'm not a fan of where Raheem stands on it, but I get it, right? Raheem is all about mitigating injury risk. It's really all about control. And right, as Raheem will explain it, coaches have more control in practices than they do in the games. And frankly, I understand it from Raheem's perspective because the Falcons don't really have the depth that they can handle. They can really afford any injuries at this time of year. They're very thin pretty much across the roster. And so for those reasons, I've made peace with Raheem's decision, even if I don't agree with it. Frankly, from my standing, it's not my job on the line, right? God willing, I'm still getting these Locked On Falcons checks, regardless of whether it helps or hurts the Falcons, whatever they do in the preseason. But, before we get into the data, I do want to talk about some caveats. This data is not meant to be the be all end all. My official stance is that I think preseason is one of several factors that impacts the outcomes early in the season. It is not the most important factor. It's probably not even in the top 5 factors. If it's in the top 10, it's because there's only 12 factors. So it's near the bottom of the totem pole as far as I'm concerned in terms of factors. I think there are bigger factors like who you're playing, quality of your opponent, different matchups, how healthy your team is versus your opponent, who your quarterback is, who your opponent's quarterback is, who your play caller is, etc. Right? The way I think of it is it's kind of like home field advantage, right? Home field advantage gets you a slight bump, right? Over the last 5 years, home teams have won about 53% of NFL games, meaning that there is an advantage, but it's by no means a definitive advantage, right? And so another way that I would explain it is like if you were facing the 2 best teams in the NFL, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, that would be Baltimore and Buffalo based off of their Super Bowl odds. If you played them to start the year, I don't think playing your guys in the preseason is going to guarantee that you're going to get a victory. It might bump up your chances of pulling off an upset a few percentage points. And the opposite would be true if you played the 2 worst teams in the season, the Saints and the Browns. Like not playing your starters is not guaranteeing that you're going to lose those games. And so to me, whatever that bump is, given that football is a quote unquote game of inches, any given Sunday, all that stuff, I think those margins, even though they are insignificant on paper to most people, I think they're significant or at least a little bit more meaningful in football because the margins are so thin. But again, I want to stress that it is not definitive. So with all those caveats, let's look at the data. And this is another opportunity for those of you that are audio listeners to check us out on YouTube so that you can see the charts in front of you. I'll do my best to link to it in the description below so that you can at least look at them when you're not driving. Again, I know some of you guys are stuck in Atlanta traffic, so you're very tempted at looking at your phone, but be safe out there, guys. But I looked at 5 teams: Atlanta, the Rams, the Bengals, the Steelers, and the Chiefs, and looked at how many preseason snaps their week 1 starting quarterback played over the last 10 years, going back to 2015 with the Falcons, Steelers, and Chiefs, going back to 2017 with the Rams, that was Sean McVay's arrival, and going back to 2020 with the Bengals when Zach Taylor got there, and compared that to how many points they scored combined over their first 4 games of the regular season. Why did I pick those 5 teams? The Rams are notorious under McVay for not playing guys in the preseason. Zach Taylor stems from that tree, also has not played guys in the preseason, although that seems to be changing. More on that later. Pittsburgh and Kansas City are obviously 2 very successful teams that regularly play their guys in the preseason. So I thought it was interesting to see if, there was a correlation there. But as we say, correlation is not causation. But I could think you can see when you look at the Falcons, there is some cause to see that when you look at the summer where Matt Ryan played the most preseason snaps of 60 back in 2016, that also happened to be the year where they had the highest scoring output in the first 4 games with 152 points. Now, again, I think probably having Kyle Shanahan had more to do with that than playing in the preseason, but you also see that trend with the Rams and the Bengals. The one time that Sean McVay played Jared Goff in the preseason was his first year in 2017, where Goff played 64 snaps in the preseason. The Rams scored 142 points in the first 4 games. Now, the following year, Goff played 0 snaps, and they still scored 140 points. So only a slight difference. But again, that's that slight bump that we're talking about. Now, the Bengals finally played Joe Burrow 13 snaps last year, and they had the best start offensively of the Zach Taylor era last year. The Chiefs with Patrick Mahomes, the most snaps he played in the preseason was 2018 with 68, and that also was the year where they had the best start offensively, scoring 145 points in the first 4 games. Now, the Steelers, not a clear trend, right? Their best start came in 2020 when they scored 118 points, and that was the summer where there was no preseason due to COVID. And you'll notice, with the Chiefs being the most notable exception, most of these teams got a significant spike in 2020 in their first 4 game scoring output, despite there not being a preseason, which is a huge reason why the anti-preseason playing guys in the preseason, people say preseason doesn't matter. And again, it goes back to what I said, the more important factors, right? 2020 saw historic scoring league-wide, right? Likely due to having no fans in the stands. Again, illustrating the point that while preseason is a factor, there's probably other ones that are far more important that decide the outcomes of early season games. Now, getting back to the Falcons, again, you can see from 2015 through 2018, there is a clear trend where the more or less Matt Ryan played in the preseason, you saw more or less points scored in those first 4 games year to year. That changed in 2019, where Matt Ryan played 57 preseason snaps, which is the second most in this sample, but the team also had the worst start of the Matt Ryan era in those first 4 games. Again, Dirk Cutter effect, play callers matter too, but we saw no preseason in the 2020 season following that, and we saw a dramatic improvement for the Falcons offense in that 2020 season, in part due to, in my opinion, Dirk Cutter being a much better play caller in 2020 than he was in 2019. That year 2 bump that we're hoping to see from Zach Robinson. And then in 2021 with Matt Ryan, he did not play in the preseason under Arthur Smith in his first year there. And you saw the second worst start of the Falcons in those Matt Ryan years in terms of their first 4 games. Then in 2022, Arthur Smith said, my bad, guys. We're going to play guys in the preseason. And Mariota and the boys got off to the best start of the Arthur Smith era. And then we saw Desmond Ridder getting less snaps than Mariota did in 2023. And you saw it dip to the worst start in the first 4 games that we have seen for the Falcons over the last 10 years. And then Kirk Cousins came in with Raheem Morris, and Kirk didn't play any preseason, but you did see improvement from the 2023 season. Again, the quarterback probably matters more than playing in the preseason, but it was the third worst start for the Falcons offense in those first 4 games. And then some observations about the other team, the Rams, other than McVay's first year, they have not played their starters at all in the preseason, whether it's Jared Goff or Matt Stafford. And you see a clear downward trend over the past 8 years with their offensive output over the first 4 games. And so I do think Sean McVay may want to consider changing things up. That's not going to happen this year because Matt Stafford's hurt, but it is something to think about in the future. The Steelers, they're all over the place. You know, they got off to much better starts when Ben Roethlisberger was there. Again, quarterbacks matter more. But it is notable that in the 3 years since, they have gotten off to slightly better starts with Trubisky and Fields getting more preseason action in 22 and 24 than Kenny Pickett did in 2023. And then the Chiefs are similar to the Rams, that they've given Mahomes less snaps since his starting debut in 2018. And you've seen a downward trend in their first 4 game scoring output overall during that time. And then when you look at the Bengals, there were reports that came out today from various NFL insiders that the Bengals announced that they are planning on playing Joe Burrow more this summer than they have in the past. And we will see if that is reflected in their scoring output later this season as a way for them to try to get off to faster starts. Another thing that you'll notice for most of these teams, that there has been a downward trend across the board for first 4 game scoring outputs over these sample size. And again, how much is that related to the NFL reducing the amount of games in the preseason? How much is that related to less practice opportunities? All that stuff and more. Certainly something worth factoring in, but that will be something that we can discuss at a later date. And again, Final thoughts. Nothing is definitive, but I do think this illustrates that there is a link. How big a link? The debate will rage on that notion. And what does that mean for this year's team? Basically, you asked me the question, do I think Michael Penix and this offense would benefit from playing in the preseason? Yes. Do I think that this team is doomed if they don't play in the preseason? No. Do I think this team is guaranteed success if they do play in the preseason? No. Like I said, who your quarterback matters. Matt Ryan, this data suggests that he clearly was a quarterback that benefited from getting more reps in the preseason. Penix might not be that guy. We saw him come off the bench cold at the end of last season, and he was just fine. That may be the case again this year. Like I said yesterday, I expect this Falcons offense to light up this Bucs defense like they did last year multiple times, right? The matchups matter more, right? Todd Bowles in this classic country cover 3 that he loves running is playing right into Zach Robinson and Michael Penix's hands. So we'll see on that. Now, do I think playing in preseason is going to guarantee them success against Brian Flores and the Vikings in week 2? No. Will it help? Maybe. Again, I'm not going to sit here and tell you, if they play 17 snaps against the Titans next week, they're guaranteed to put a 30 burger up against the Vikings, but maybe it bumps the odds that they do that slightly. How much is undefined at this point. And ultimately, that's the coaching decision that Raheem Morris has to weigh, right? Is chasing that bump worth the injury risk? His answer is clearly no. That's fine. I don't agree with it, but that's the choice that he's meant to make. I don't make that choice. So it's whatever it is. So to me, it's all an interesting debate. Everybody has an opinion. I think far too many people paint it as a black or white thing when I think clearly it's a shade of gray. And I'm sure, the Falcons and the Rams have done their own studies. A big reason why the Rams do it the way that they do. And Raheem probably has seen those studies and why he's doing it this way as opposed to the way that Dan Quinn used to do it. And I'm sure, those studies probably show it's far less of a factor than this study I just presented to you, this very flawed study that I presented to you today. So it's a no one size fits all. It's a case by case. Some players may benefit from getting those reps in the preseason. Others might not, right? It's similar to how you coach players. Some players can handle, hard coaching. Others do not, right? It's almost as if, every human being on this planet is unique and different, and you can't put anybody in a box. The only boxes that you can put all human beings in is there's 2 boxes. There's the Bijan Robinson fans, and there's all the people that haven't watched him play yet. And other than that box, everybody's a unique and beautiful snowflake. So those are my thoughts on playing the preseason. We'll probably get Jarvis Davis's thoughts on that on tomorrow's episode. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On Bets. Lee Sterling, Kevin Rogers are going to give you those MLB locks and football futures. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.